Good evening and welcome to the Holocaust Memorial Event Series 2022, supported by the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities as part of the Humanities Cultural Programme. My name is Barnabas and I'm the convener of this series. Each year on Holocaust Memorial Day, we come together to remember the 6 million Jews who were killed during the Holocaust and the millions who suffered under Nazi persecution in subsequent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur. The theme for Holocaust Memorial Day 2022 is One Day. This encourages us to think about the individual days in history that hold extreme significance, the days when life changed for the victims of genocide, and the day in the future without genocides towards which we all strive. But one day also acts as a somber reminder that a day will come when Holocaust survivors are no longer able to share their powerful testimonies. On that day, it will fall to us to tell their stories. This event series builds on last year's work that we've done at the university to bring together high-profile individuals from the UK's commemorative community, in person and online like today, for open discussion and bridge building around Holocaust Memorial Day. Although 77 years after the end of the Holocaust, its history and memory remain important for society, a society that's facing rising anti-Semitism, contemporary genocide, and international humanitarian crises. Learning and reflecting on the Holocaust thus encourages us to consider what we want our own common future to look like. This series, aware that one day survivors will not be around to tell their stories, asserts the responsibility of us as the younger generations to carry forward their memory. Today, we're joined by TV judge Rob Rinder MBE, who first shared his testimony of the Holocaust in a series of television programs, including Who Do You Think You Are?, My Family, the Holocaust, and Me, where he took children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors to retrace their families' footsteps and discover their stories. In conversation with activist and advocate Kirsty Robson, Rob will discuss his experience of discovering his family's connection to the Holocaust and of sharing it in public, and the role that telling these personal stories has in tackling racism, discrimination, and intolerance today. After a briefing conversation, we'll be open to any questions from the audience, which I'll be asking. If you have these questions at any point, please do place them into the YouTube chat, where we'll be able to pick them up to ask at the end. And so it falls to me with great pleasure to introduce Kirsty and Rob. Kirsty Robson is a final year undergraduate student at the University of the West of Scotland, focusing on anti-Semitism and social media. She has a background in genocide education and commemoration, including serving as the Scotland support worker for the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust and a regional ambassador for the Holocaust Educational Trust. Kirsty has held various positions in outreach, development, and project management for non-profits across the United Kingdom, and is currently working for Show Racism the Red Card Scotland. Passionate about finding new ways of tackling discrimination and intolerance, she believes in the importance of young people working together for a safer society. Joining her is Rob Rinder MBE. Known to most people as a TV judge, Rob Rinder is a supporter of the Holocaust Educational Trust. His maternal grandfather was a Holocaust survivor who came to the UK as one of the Windermere children who arrived in the Lake District after the Second World War. Rinder shared his history of the Holocaust on television in a series of programs, and it is a pleasure to have him joining us here today. Kirsty and Rob, thank you for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barnabas, and thank you for inviting us to have what I think is going to be a really useful and important conversation as part of your truly incredible series. It's wonderful to see, even in times where we can't be together, we are together and we're able to come together to mark such an important day as Holocaust Memorial Day. So Rob, thanks for coming and thanks for speaking to me. Obviously, Barnabas has given us a bit of background regarding your television appearances, regarding your family story, but I'd be interested to know, what's your earliest memory of the Holocaust being discussed in your family?
Well, first of all, thank you, Kirsty, and thank you, Barnabas, and the Oxford Research Centre for the Humanities, and for everybody who's taken the time, the critical currency that we all have in our lives to be here today. And what Barnabas says, I feel confident, will be a thread that weaves itself into the tapestry of our conversation, which is that as the survivors, like my grandfather, who's no longer with us, diminish, the responsibility to remember and everything that ensues from that falls on us. It's a really hard question to answer that. I've been asked it before. And what's interesting is I've gone back as we were producing the second series of documentaries, really to authentically reflect on that answer, because I don't know. What I'll tell you is that it was, to use a double negative, never not there. In other words, my grandfather, who was a central presence in my life, very small family, single mum, one auntie and a grandma and a grandfather who used to pick us up from school. We were never far away from the immediacy of his presence and influence. He was a huge central force. But also I was aware from as young as I can remember of this sort of strange whisper around him. And he was somebody that, as I hope no doubt we'll discuss, as a result and the product of his trauma and consequent lived experience, was an unusual, to say the very least, eccentric and in many respects explosive character. And even from a young age, anybody that's around somebody like that, that it's not necessarily normal, but you may come to normalize it. I certainly was aware that some of his behaviors were unusual, partly because he was presented as somebody foreign, but there was this other dark element. And from the youngest age I can think of, I knew that there was the Holocaust, never described, expressed in that way as a historical event, but the earliest germ of a memory being, if you like, communicated through this loud, quiet, dangerous expression, what he's been through. So it might mean that, to give an example to people who have come today, there might be some strange thing he might say, or some perhaps behavior that seemed odd or unusual, out of the ordinary of other grandparents. And he would say, the quiet response was, well, that's because of what he's been through. And gradually over a period of time, as we spent more time with him, there's, as you'll know from your experience having spent time with survivors, it doesn't emerge, certainly them, in one coherent narrative, a moment where you sit down and tell the story. It comes through us, my brother and I, through a series of triggered moments where we'd sit across the table and he'd tell one story, perhaps. The result of which is that I had little pieces of a dark jigsaw, but not the complete picture.
I think the idea of it's never that one time where they share their story is something I've certainly experienced working with survivors. But turning to you, you first started sharing your family story publicly on Who Do You Think You Are? What made you want to do that? What made you want to have that opportunity to start telling your story? And were you hesitant to sort of begin that journey so publicly?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, who do you think you are? Let's do the basic stuff. They sort of come to you and explore your family history and then make a determination as to whether or not it's interesting. And it's worth sort of centering on that program, because I should say, to answer the question at the end of that journey is some really good news. And we're starting, with a bleakness and this difficult, to say the very least, subject matter that we're about to go into. But I should tell you that I was the least famous. If I turn to my right, I can see the TV guide of the other people who are in it, Olivia Colman and Boy George, etc. And what's fascinating about it is once that program went out, we start at the end of the journey, despite being the least well-known, I would have thought, person amongst that group, it was the most watched by a mile. And we know, because BBC do quality research, it wasn't because of me. It was because of the subject matter. Over 4.5 million people tuned in on that night to watch. To give you an idea of that, some of the metrics, about double the viewers of the other programmes in the series. And also there wasn't a peep of anti-Semitism on social media. Now, I threw it clear in that way just in case we forget it, because I think it's important. Why did I want to share it? It's because I knew part of the picture. And again, if anybody's watched the Who Do You Think You Are, what doesn't come out perhaps as loudly as it should was that actually I had this enormous privilege of going back to Poland where my grandfather was with him in 1998. So I was just finishing being an undergraduate at that time. And I don't think was perhaps emotionally ready or mature enough, or took the fact that my parents were young and so was he relatively, for granted that he would be around for a long period of time. And at some point, in not beyond the horizon, there'd be a moment where this coherent narrative would come out in the way that you describe, and you correctly say it never does, in order, in other words. Just to give you a flavour of some of the stuff, like over the years, we would be sitting at the table when I was as young as 9 or 7, and there might be a scar on his face. And, you know, when you're 7, you're disinhibited in a way that my mum could never be, because it was her father. And so there's an infinitely greater sense of inherited trauma and a red line, which is a don't go beyond for the second generation in a much more powerful way. But as a young grandson, somehow that trauma is inherited in a different way. You're enabled to ask those challenging conversations, which you intuitively feel are less likely to do violence or damage to the person that's looking after you. So grandchildren usually are better agents at asking those challenging questions. And he would tell us stories. You know, I remember once saying something about going to the front of the queue, and he said, I pushed myself in front of the line somewhere. He said, never do that. And he told this story about how he'd been in the camps one day, and in fact, I then discovered it was Kozisko Kamena. And it looked like the easy work was work A, and he'd been put in work C. So he found himself, as he always did, breaking conventional rules and and standing in the queue into work A, which looked like the easier work. And he was discovered and beaten. Well, it turned out that what was happening at that concentration camp was they were making some ammunition and working without any protective gear, all of which was toxic. And the life expectancy of people in that queue was about 3 months. And although more challenging work in work C, at the back of the queue where he found himself was more backbreaking, it's the reason he survived. Don't push yourself forward. His relationship with food and so on and so forth. When he died, which is the end of the story, despite probably objectively, as we discovered, having some kind of economic comfort and could have lived his life with certainly a greater degree of security, we discovered little bits of food at the back of wardrobes and drawers and that sort of thing. The other thing we discovered, for instance, this doesn't directly answer your question, I'm afraid, but was books. I mean, almost this vast library of books about the Third Reich would often reference Albert Speer as if he was on some, I can only retrospectively apply whatever pop psychology I have to him, but this sense that he had an enduring mission to understand and wasn't afraid of going back to look at that material in order to do what he could, insofar as he could, intellectually, to place how and why what happened. But it wasn't this coherent narrative. But in 1998, we went back with him to Pietrzakov-Trybunalski, where he was from. And it's really interesting, Kirsty, because, you know, I hope we'll get onto this discussion about how we talk about the Holocaust, and one of the challenges is it being presented through black and white and often exclusively through the prism of Auschwitz, and how that's very important, but it's one part of the story. And I'd rather assumed he'd come from a town like Anatevka, if that means anything to anyone listening. You know, I'd forgotten how integrated, or just didn't know how integrated really, the Jews were in that town, but also the deep seams and the deep richness of Jewish life for the better part of 800 years we stop and think about that just for a second, he was Polish. So he started speaking Polish. And I then went back to the place he was from, as I say, and we had this moment which is not actually spoken about in the series. And I've shared a couple of times, but it's one of the most profound moments of my life, where we were in this sort of courtyard. And it was just at that moment, it changed by the time I did Who Do You Think You Are? Because it was the late 90s. So Eastern Poland, which suffered the scars of being behind the Iron Curtain in a much kind of deeper economic way, perhaps in the West. And so you could just see the beginnings of industrial sort of decline at that point. But the glass factory where he had served, I use that language, where he'd been an indentured slave, was still open and making glass. And the place where he was brought up, that courtyard with a flat, was still being lived in, albeit it was at that point, as I say, beginning to disintegrate. And we walked up the stairs together and looked through the window, and we saw the wallpaper, which is the same wallpaper he had as a child. And there's something for those who are doing history or humanities of every kind. A number of people I intuitively think will understand this. When you have that capacity to stand alongside somebody and look into an object that was there and precisely the same. Right? Think of a quality example. You go to the Tower of London, you look at a brick, and if you can crowd out the flight path the way up to Heathrow and you squint enough, you imagine yourself seeing the same thing that perhaps Berlin did on the way to the scaffold. These things are like time machines, emotional. They have all of this sort of emotional imprint on them. And he was telling us these stories. And as we walked down the stairs, there was a woman that came up to him. And she looked at him and he touched her. And that's as much as I can say, because it's almost a moment where poetry ends and prose begins. And they didn't say very much. And for us, it was the first time that he spoke Polish, which we didn't know about, or this Polish identity. And it turned out, the long and short of it, is that her family had been the only non-Jewish family living in this very impoverished courtyard. And they were the non-Jewish family that would light the fires on the Sabbath for everybody else. And this woman who had played with him had survived the war and had no idea that he had survived at all. They said everything and nothing in the 2 or 3 seconds they spoke to each other. She looked at him and he just touched her on the shoulder. And it was a moment of, whatever your faith is at all, was a moment of, if you're a person without faith, of profound human connection, if you are of the quite literal divine. And so I'd had this experience, but he never said anything. That was it. That was the beginning, middle, and end of it. And I didn't know the names or any of the details of his family, his sisters, his brother. It was this kind of patchy words and names sort of existing in, as I say, this kind of loud, shadowy whispers. And it mattered to me to piece the story together so that the public at large could understand a little bit about it. Of course, as we went on the journey, because that's the right word for it, they deliberately curate and make the programme very beautifully by an unbelievably emotionally literate director called David Vincent, who won a BAFTA, in fact, for that particular episode. You discover the various things as you go along, so it's totally authentic. And sort of fast forward now 22 years or whatever it was more than that, or was about that, to the same quadrangle and the same apartment building, and now it's in complete decay. The glass factory has disappeared and disintegrated into what looks like a sort of jagged suggestion of what was there, but it's pretty much an art installation. And I found myself sitting on the banister, touching that wood where he had grown up, with the only expert from Piotrków-Trybunalski's history, who, as if anybody saw the programme will discover, was a man called Nathanael, whose grandfather had been my grandfather's best friend and lived in the same building. It was my grandfather's 95th birthday, and I had no idea. But what mattered more than anything else was to get this specific detail, the names of the people, the names of his sisters and his parents. And it's interesting for those historians out there, and anybody that has a perhaps vested or just general interest in perhaps finding their own personal history, what matters. And to this extent, I think what was fascinating to me is that I was aware I was the subject of a program. Of course, there's a camera on you, but there was, for want of a better way, or a less sort of highfalutin academic way of describing it, there were kind of micro and macro things happening at the same time. The macro thing was I was aware we're telling a really important story, so it mattered to get it right. The micro thing was I realized that for my mum and my mum's sister, who were brought up with this powerful force of a Holocaust survivor who was the most critical presence in their life and has formed so much of their identity and their personal history and their perspective on the world. Me to an important extent too, but for them so much. They knew nothing. That I was both finding out this information for them in a deeply personal way that would matter to them, in a deeply significant emotional way, but also the fact we're telling a history story as well. And just to give you a good example of what I mean by that, Nathaniel's grandfather, it turned out, who died fairly recently, and I should tell you, I had no idea who he was. This man was showing me pictures of my grandfather at Nathaniel's bar mitzvah in Israel. He'd never mentioned him to us. And Nathaniel's grandfather had kept an almanac, a sort of periodical of life in Piotrków-Trybunalski. Some of the listeners who have tuned in today or have logged in will know of Ben Helfgott, Sir Ben Helfgott, who comes from the same town. And in the course of in this little almanac, he had something called the Life of the Melanik family, talking about my grandfather's family. And it had the names of the sisters, but it had the name of his father. Really good example, called Elimelech. My name is Reuven Elimelech, named for him. And it was one sentence, Kirsty, and it said, this man, Elimelech, a baker, what his job was a man short of stature, high of hopes, darting about the place, always busy. Words to that effect, a translation. His mother, she was a diligent mum who was very religious, and the children good at drama, very diligent at school. In each one of those kind of verbs and adjectives, people talk about the power of language, and it's especially true in the Jewish faith, actually, and for me, quite literally breathing life, giving animation to what would otherwise be a name. On the micro level, on the personal, emotional level, knowing that I could bring that back to my mom and my aunt, say this is who these people were. And even in that one sentence about Elimelech, small in stature, high in hope, starting about the place, that was my grandfather in a nutshell. So it located him outside of the Shoah, outside of the Holocaust. It gave a human context for his family, who were never spoken of, who they were, and in every one of those words, some element of the tapestry of their humanity.
Gosh, it's so incredible to hear you speak about that, and you actually answered one of the questions I was going to ask, but I'll frame it in a different way. Who do you think you are? Was talking personally for a minute, an opportunity for me to show family and friends the information I look at on a daily basis in a way that was slightly more digestible for them. And while I was preparing for this event, my mum and I sat and watched through it, and we watched it when it came out, and we watched it again. And it's that incredibly raw moment where you find out it's his 95th birthday as you're sitting in that courtyard. And that's really the opening to this journey. And I'm glad you used the word journey, because it's the one I think sums it up the best. I find it's a great privilege for myself and the audience and anybody who watched it to be part of such a raw journey. And I can't imagine how potentially difficult it could have been to open up that incredibly emotional setting to a wide audience that you don't know how they're going to digest it. So was there any hesitancy in opening?
No. Yeah, there was no hesitancy. I tend to sort of think the best of the British people, and it turns out that's why I more than throat clear to tell that story at the beginning, lest I forget, which is how well it was received and what a broad thirst there was to hear it. And, Kirsty, I must remember what we know is, as I say, good BBC metrics, one of the things they get really right is to do the post-game research. And a lot of people that came to that documentary and the others watched no BBC at all. And they came with an open mind, wanting to hear and to understand more. I didn't have necessarily any personal fears, but in that regard, either how it would be received. What matters, to anybody listening is, I think this is a space, despite the fact there are a number of organizations working in this field, there is, I think, no better case for more is more. And so I wasn't sort of worried about it from my personal point of view. But then again, I must emphasize, and this perhaps takes it into a new direction and adds a new complexion, I'm third generation. And also, Barnabas's introduction called me a TV judge, which is true, undoubtedly. Whatever I write and stuff, and however much I lecture, most of my work leading up to this point, I ended up on television by a series of accidents, was doing law, and above all else, kind of rather complex towards the end of my regular practicing career, international law. And so, there was also an element of me that was able to, or cared about locating it with a degree, insofar as I possibly could, of dispassion. And that's the macro aspect of it, if you like. So the micro thing is, what will this mean for my family, my mum and my aunt, bringing back this information, and for us? But on a macro level, what does this mean? Bearing in mind, this is my grandfather's story. How can we use this, deploy it, and share it in a way that's just going to have real, significant and lasting resonance? And how best can I use this kind of bizarre platform that I've been gifted by a series of random accidents to do this? So I wasn't worried. I always kind of live in the light of hope, just as my grandfather did. And perhaps the last thing I would say as the end to your answer to that story, you having had that immeasurable, limitless gift of spending time with survivors, is that now, especially in their lives, they do imbue you with that sense of mission and purpose and light. And bizarrely, even when they share their stories of horror, however horrifying, the curious thing that I have discovered, learning about my grandfather's life, as he stood there through the jagged memory of what this factory was, hearing the train go past, that was the line that his parents were on their way to Treblinka, I nevertheless felt this sort of hopeful sense that what we were doing mattered and had the genuine, authentic possibility of making some kind of, not permanent, not necessarily global, but some significant positive change.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things I took away from Who Do You Think You Are was the lovely but heartbreaking moment of you and Sir Ben Helfgott talking about that, family shared experiences and how no two stories will be identical, but so many shared themes will be among them. And I'm sure we've got lots of Het ambassadors tuning in tonight who have heard from Ben Helfgott, his family and his friends. Nice. They're so incredible.
Can I say, because I didn't know he was going to be there.
Really?
It was I can't emphasize how beautifully, again, one of the things about being a presenter on television, I present Good Morning Britain, various things these days, the amount of credit you get for standing at the goal line, smoking a fag, and everyone does the work and you push the ball over the goal. Everyone says, what an amazing program you make. Now, I did work, as I hope we'll come to discuss, on the mission of My Holocaust, My Family and Me, and how we selected the stories. And I think that's an important part of this conversation, especially given Oxford Research Centre for the Humanities is very involved here, and I care about this conversation very deeply. But at the same time, everybody else had done a great deal of the work, including not telling me that I was going to meet Ben in that forest in Schlieber. And, I talked about that moment that my grandfather had met this woman when he was still alive. I didn't expect Ben to be there. I know a lot of perhaps these listeners of people are considering going to some of the sites in perhaps Auschwitz. Usually it's become a kind of synonym for the Holocaust, which in of itself is a discussion we need to have, important though it is. This was a wooded place, like lots of places, which only had, again, this sort of weird, jagged suggestion of what was there. So I was just walking in a forest. And there's a sort of a curious dissonance to that, much like Treblinka, where it's a park or a forest. But what mattered being there, and I would say to anybody listening, if you're considering going to wherever, whichever site, please take the time and trouble to go in winter. I feel like that matters in a way that I wouldn't have thought about until I was there. And so we were standing there in that place with just this sort of flattened ground where it was. It was a tiny museum. The place was, I think, going to be developed, but was saved by a quite beautiful righteous collection of, if that's the correct collective noun for teachers, as it should be, of teachers who lobbied the German government to save it as a museum and got Ben involved. So the Schlieben Museum is there. It was the satellite camp of Buchenwald. And what was extraordinary to me and what mattered was to think how, despite having a coat and all the rest of it and all of the things that one would expect and prepare oneself for to stand on that earth at that time of the year in January, it was absolutely freezing to the bone and would have given anything to stop. At one stage, we all had to stop and go into a car to warm up. And to think about my grandfather there in rags. And that moment when I was with Ben and he said, I'd like to tell you what your grandfather looked like when I saw him here on this earth. There's no end to the profundity of what that does to you. But it wasn't the beginning of the paragraph. The ending of the paragraph had the most light in it, which was where he held my hand and he said, come on, let's walk out of this place. Let's walk out together. And at the end of that moment, what of course you don't see, is that this museum that he'd been part of, and there's a picture of him sitting with this family of teachers who had saved this place as a commemorative piece of earth and space and museum, quite beautifully curated museum, I might add. They ate lunch together. And it's difficult to describe the kind of impact and influence it had. Safe to say that it allowed me in a deeply sensory way to have a tiny limited insight into the physical pain that so many of those who experience slave labor suffered.
I think everybody watches these programs and wishes for more, and I think this is a great opportunity. I wish that episode had lasted for 3 hours and we could have seen everything. I think on that note of let's leave this place together, it'd be great to hear a little bit more about how your grandfather and Ben and survivors like them arrived in Britain.
Yeah, it's such a good story. It's worth remembering. So they ended up in, by and large, not exclusively, but in Theresienstadt, and a certain there was a response from the British government to grant temporary, and I might emphasize that to anybody listening, temporary visas to child survivors to come to the UK before they left and went elsewhere to surviving family or to mandated Palestine. And my grandfather took that offer up, but of course faked his age and pretended to be a child when he wasn't in any way, as far as we can gather, entitled to that particular programme at the time. And they found themselves in Windermere. And that's a wonderful story. And again, anybody watching, please go and see. I mean, hopefully it looks like it's now going to be funded, the Calgarth estate, with the brilliant and righteous work of Trevor Avery. I keep using that word deliberately because people all know about the righteous amongst the Gentiles. People who take up this story and make it their own, whatever their background, as a means to giving them the kind of some sort of narrative which helps them with courage and how they frame their moral universe. I think the story of the child survivors is a good idea, but there were 732 of them. They're called the boys, though the boys and girls amongst them. And they describe it themselves as having gone from quite literally this sort of hell. I don't like that language, but hell and loss. And they end up in being restored in the Calgarth estate with psychologists, well, Jewish Relief play a significant part, as do local people who respond not from major cities, but in this sort of small part of the country you wouldn't necessarily think of, in ways that imbue the vast majority of them with a deep and passionate love of this country, especially democracy under the rule of law and Britishness, which is hard to describe. safe to say that it absolutely informed my grandfather's, if you like, kind of political point of view, which was limitless open-mindedness. His best friend was a first-generation Jamaican, who I think we've actually discovered was a Windrush Jamaican. They were the odd couple who would walk around Stamford Hill together. He would often go to mosques and just have random afternoons speaking to people. I sort of, although a Jewish faith, I'm not sure he believed in it. It was much more an expression of defiance. I always get the sense his kind of theology, orthodox theology, and if you like, a sense of covered respect for his parents, but this sense of the world which was open and tolerant, to be very sure, but also something else, that he'd touched the face of tyranny. So all the values, those essential values of the rule of law mattered to him in a way that I didn't necessarily put together until I started at the bar and was some years in. So for example, standing at Speaker's Corner and listening to anti-Semitic bile, and he'd go, "Hess, in this country, this man can say what he likes." And that having a currency and a value, which I never really understood at the time. But anyway, they were restored in Windermere, and they had their first experiences of the country there. And it's an enormously valuable place to visit. And what's really exciting, and again, to use that language feels curious, perhaps in this context of this conversation, but just how wonderful the community are there of historians and Trevor Avery and several others who are working out ways to, in fact, there've been lots of visitors there, to think about, if you like, it stands as a really important beacon for what this country can be at its best. And that bit of the story for me, as you would have seen on the Who Do You Think You Are, as I discovered him being refilled with that sense of humanity, having the emotional currency to start a relationship with my grandmother. And I never heard him speak in any emotional way whatsoever. A young man who was perhaps unsure of himself, a man who clearly had the capacity and even the language to talk about trauma, to look at those letters and see the beginning of that journey, how he was not restored, but at least put together sufficient to build a life, was, again, on that micro level, to gift my family and others. My family, because it told us more about him, but to other people, perhaps who have parents who have experienced trauma, the product of trauma, new citizens, perhaps for them to kind of locate that trauma in them and to understand that whatever their parent was a product of their past too. And so to locate them in a more healthy way.
Absolutely. I think this is probably a poignant moment to turn to my family, the Holocaust, and me, because that really was an opportunity for other people to share their stories and retrace those family stories. So in that, you helped other second and third generation Holocaust survivors retrace their family stories. I'd love to know more about how Bernie, Naomi, Louisa, and Natalie came to be involved, and what did it mean to you to be part of sharing their stories?
It's sort of limitless gift, really. I mean, of all of the obscene privileges that you get just for being on television, none of which I got, working thankless hours wherever I was in the world, in Sierra Leone, etc. But it's a platform, you don't get it forever. The BBC, after this is not a cynical thing to say, but it is true, after discovering that if you tell stories well, and if you tell them authentically, and if you tell the story of the Holocaust in a way which includes as many people as possible with a vested sense of responsibility and allows it to sing and to speak to everybody, people will come to it. Mm-hmm. Even an audience for whom history may not be something that they immediately connect with their daily lives or something they're connected to. And so we talked about this, and the director, first of all, the same production company, and critically, David Vincent, director, who is an extraordinary person in a number of ways, and is perhaps, despite the BAFTA, the most unsung of the people amongst the Holocaust, my family and me, wanted to tell this story, but especially we wanted to tell the story of second generation coming to discover this, what happened. And as you know, and I've mentioned, I'm third generation, and that does have some emotional and psychological significance too. Barnabas opened this discussion today saying, as the survivors diminish, the responsibility falls on us. Well, there is a special responsibility on the second generation, and a number of them feel that. So the question really that you ask is, bearing in mind how many stories there are, is how did we choose? Or rather, how were the stories chosen? Bearing in mind how many we could have told. So people who watch the documentary would have seen that my role was not really to present it as much as to be part of the curation to a degree, but to tell two aspects of the story. So one was to go back with my mum to Treblinka to make Kaddish, the memorial prayer, that central moment. And to, as we said as earlier, to now we knew the names of my grandfather's four sisters, his brother and his parents under that earth, to learn more about it and to make that ritual, not for that rather ugly word which people use, I think, if they're the unpsychologically initiated or lack depth, closure. There's no such thing, but to do cover, to give respect to them and for people to understand what happened. But what I wasn't aware of, Kirsty, is that, and again, this is David's choice, and I gave him the agency, and despite not having to, trusting him as I did, we didn't know, because I had read some misinformation that the last survivor of Treblinka, bearing in mind what happened, there was a revolt there in 43 and it was burned to the ground, but we know, because of the reliable, very detailed diary kept by the commandant, which has been published, that the last survivor was in fact alive, and he lived in a town in Gothenburg, and I didn't know we were going to meet him until about 20 minutes before. So I'm with my mum there. And because she's my mum, I don't really take, the truth of the matter is, you're so looked after by a mum. It's very rare if you've got somebody with the deep emotional range, intelligence and depth of my mum to ever feel that one needs to look after her. And if I have any element of regret, it's not considering that at all, but rather taking for granted that she was ready and perfectly equipped to manage this, which she was ready at that time. But nevertheless, I didn't even consider, as I'm asked all the time, did you think about the impact of, no, because she's her and she's my mum and she's just great at this stuff. But we didn't know we were going to meet Leon Ritz. And as some people would have seen in that story, that moment rather, we went ostensibly simply to stand at the stone that commemorated Pietrikov Tribunalski, lay stones, and to make Kaddish with my mum. We met him. And he's the only living human being that saw what happened in that place. And as we were standing together, we walked back to the central stone, which is the only memory of what's in that place. Again, you know, Auschwitz, the curated museum, is so important to see, to visit, to touch, viscerally capable of making significant change in people. But most of the sites where people were murdered exist under this curious paradox of a lovely park in the sunshine under green earth, where people are having picnics. And that's, to an extent, other than this memorial, rather what Treblinka looks like. And as we were standing together, and my mum got out her siddur, her prayer book, to make the Kaddish, and I was about to say the names of our family who had died there, you know, bearing in mind I'm also part of making this programme, and Leon put his arm around me, and I've looked on the rushes and I can't find it, but I know he touched me. It was a curious moment. And he said, no, this is for all the living people of the world. So we don't say Kaddish just for us, it's for all the, and I can't get it out of my head, ever. And also people have seen, I followed another story in my past through my other paternal grandfather who only died last year, who were murdered in Divinashuk, hand to head. The story of the war, Baba Yar, etc., of the Einsatzgruppen, etc., of communities turning against communities, especially in the East, who in the course of the Shoah killed people in the most brutal ways imaginable. And I speak enough Russian to, when our interpreter stopped interpreting halfway through the, a significant way through rather, the interview with her, I carried on. And again, what David hadn't told me at the end of this interview, which I found challenging, because although my Russian is good enough to speak to her to a degree, certainly to understand what she was saying, I'm still interpreting, and it doesn't have the emotional cushion of the direct or indirect article. There's no or the. And there's something that lands on you like a concrete block when somebody says Jew child, as you're translating it in your head. But she described the ground moving 3 days after this massacre took place. And I was told by David we were going to go to a Soviet memorial, many of which I've seen, many of which in Cyrillic say the death of the Soviet people, but don't specify in any to any great degree who's under the earth there or under the memorial. What I didn't expect to find, as people will have seen if they watched the programme, the first part of it, was that I saw topographically precisely the mass grave that she described, ring-fenced. I didn't know I was going to see that. And they put the camera and said, look, please forgive us, we're just going to just film your reaction. And I have no memory. I obviously watched the programme back because we had to do the voiceover, you know. I don't think I've shared this story. And as I was doing the voiceover, I watched what I had said and truly have no memory what I said. But for anybody watching, what I said was informed by the work I've done over the years before coming on to being a TV judge and etc. in various parts of the world. This is not the only mound of earth like this on the earth even today. And it's the only part of that whole journey, including Treblinka, work, I can think of, not perfectly easily, but I can think about it and be okay. That mound of earth, I have no memory of at all. Just very briefly, sorry, because I'm banging on and I don't want to eat into questions that people have. The other stories were really difficult to choose. And so, although there were no specific criteria, there were three aspects to them, which I think really does matter, and especially matters for the nature of our audience today. Like, how did we choose them? The first one is, you will have noticed watching that documentary that other than my own story, every single one of the stories took place in Western Europe. And I care about that a great deal, and increasingly. Some of the challenges about telling the stories for the Holocaust, and again through Auschwitz, exclusively, is it's often told through the rather emotionally alienating prism of black and white, as if it happened at historical arm's length. And through that film of black and white, even Schindler's List and so on and so forth, it feels like a long time ago, which immediately doesn't have a sense of urgency. Also, it's when it's told through the prism of Eastern Europe, it feels somehow dislocated from our lived experiences today, as if it was an explosion of violence of one unassimilated community versus the other. Not dissimilar from the type of history that we understand about pogroms and so on and so forth. Yet another instance of Jewish anti-Semitism, of state-sponsored anti-Semitism in the East, which had been the historical experience of Jews for as long as they existed in that part of the world. So it mattered to me in a great deal to commemorate the fact that this took root not there. So the story of Bernie and Frankfurt, and of course Louisa and Natty's story, who I've known since I was very young. I've known their story, and their mum never spoke about it at all. Their mother, she's the same as me, in Holland, and of course in France. And so when you juxtapose the images you will have seen, which David cut so thoughtfully, what we get is that sense, especially in the German story, that this took root in the cradle at that time of the most advanced liberal democracy in the world. And I really cared about telling that story, because that has a greater resonance now when we think about the Holocaust, to remember never to be complacent about our democracy. There's a column I wrote yesterday, and that anybody working in Holocaust studies seeks to shout about quietly, loudly, and to perhaps is the critical fuel that keeps us going in this storytelling, is to remember that we think and reflect on Vienna and in Weimar Germany, to think about the beginning of women's rights, and to think about all the art and the culture and so on and so forth, all of which you can read about, and to understand that it was a slow process that led into the depravity of the show. So it mattered that they were located in Western Europe. And we'll go on to it perhaps, but there's a number of things that we left on the cutting room floor which were just extraordinary. Just one quick story. Natty and Louisa, for instance, we began to tell her grandfather's story. We had to cut it because we just didn't have time. We followed the story of Els. Her grandfather was a well-known architect called Chen. And he was survived in the Thebauhaus style, and he was rescued by the underground by a guy called Hein, And the two of them, I got a call. This is now, gosh, it feels like an eon ago because of COVID, but 3 years ago. They were driving to Northern Holland and they come across a beautiful Thebauhaus style house. And the man who rescued them is a man called Henk. They knock at the door. This old man answered. And he said, I've been waiting for you to come. And that was Henk. And he was a man that had rescued their grandfather. And their grandfather, as thanks, had built this house for them. And he brought his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren up in this house. He died not long after they'd met. I've been waiting for you to come. And Louisa, who has always loved this particular period of design history, had over the years bought and drawn various bits of furniture. And if you go to her scrapbook of drawings, the furniture, all of which was designed by their grandfather, Rein, looks exactly like the drawings that she had made over the years, which was quite extraordinary. Two very quick other elements, of course, was the fact that we also wanted to talk about second generational trauma, which is a very important thing when trying to make this story a universal one. Whoever you are, be that you're a new citizen, when we think about and we reflect upon on again, this micro macro level, when we think about perhaps the victims of genocide and how they go on to parent, that's a huge issue. But even on a very basic level, the second generation are at the acute end of what it means to be parented by people who are so profoundly damaged by their experiences. And so one of the things that was very interesting was a conversation that ensued on social media and in other spaces about how somebody might have a parent who behaved in a variety of challenging ways, especially if anybody was parented during the Second World War. And what you realize very quickly, and it often helps a lot of people, is to understand that that generation especially, and all of our parents, are the products of their own experiences and very often their own trauma. And to some extent, that can give a degree, I think, of important help to those who are really trying to come to terms with whatever damage they experienced their own parents, to give them their full narrative. And the very last element was, in a number of the stories, there was evidence or instances of courage and rescuing. And I think the more we tell those stories, the better. So where it was Marianne Cohn, for example, in Noemi's story, incidentally, Noemi came to see me and wanted to tell her father's story, and we met for coffee. And literally as she was leaving, I said, "What about your mother?" And she said, "Well, she doesn't really consider herself to be a Holocaust survivor." And her story ended up being the one that we told. And for me, actually touches me most deeply. And the reason we tell the story of Marianne Cohn, a 21-year-old who put her body and life on the line to save Jewish children, is that I think the more we talk about stories of courage and heroism in that way, I think people hearing these stories in the context of the Holocaust, we can't just tell part of this story without also understanding that perhaps understandably, people want to cast themselves back at that time with a heroic narrative. We all want to do it anyway. And I think the more stories we tell about that heroism, people confronted by moral evil who made that choice, often that cost them their lives, that sort of real heroism, not social media, Instagram heroism, I think the more we tell and share those stories, I think young people especially, but others, will also have, or perhaps it will imbue them with a sense of courage to learn more about the Holocaust and go on to take it personally for themselves and become witnesses within their own communities. Lastly, I always think of that Maya Angelou quote, you can't practice any of the virtues consistently without courage. So the rescuer stories are desperately important within the context of this history, because I think more than anything else, it's a moment which we can reach where we can ask ourselves, really, what would you do? And here are the people that were on the right side of history, and who are you? So as a teaching tool, it's enormously useful.
Thank you, Rob. And I think that's a wonderful note, just as we approach Holocaust Memorial Day. What can you do? How can you learn? Where are we going? How does this play a part in us moving forward in this field. And I think the one thing that I know Barnabas and I have always spent a lot of time talking about is when you hear survivor testimony, you yourself become the witness. And I think this has been a real unique opportunity to see how many different formats that viewing of a testimony can come through. So Rob, it's been an enormous privilege. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. And as always, it's wonderful to speak to you. I wish we had 3,000 more hours to go through everything.
Thank you.
We can at some point, but it would be a privilege. It's a privilege to speak to you as always. So on that note, I would like to hand back to Barnabas.
Thank you, Kirsty. And thank you, Rob, for spending the last hour with us discussing this.
Oh gosh, it's been an hour. I'm sorry, I thought we were going to stop for questions. I'm sorry, I didn't realise. I'm so sorry. Sorry.
Not at all. We have been receiving some questions throughout, and Kirsty's been silently weaving them in.
Good.
So we're very grateful to everyone who's contributed to us over the past hour. Rob, I first met you several years ago at an event run by the Holocaust Educational Trust, and you gave such an inspiring speech, interviewing a Holocaust survivor and sharing us something that Kirsty has just mentioned, the fact that when you hear from a survivor, you become a witness yourself. I know that as we approach Holocaust Memorial Day in just 2 days' time, people across the country will have the opportunity to watch Holocaust survivors share their testimony as part of the UK ceremony for Holocaust Memorial Day, streamed online at 7 p.m. on the 27th of January. I hope that many people will join us in watching that. I hope that they will have been inspired today by hearing you, by hearing your journey of discovery, and your journey that has had such an impact on you, but also on your family and everyone else. I'm so proud that we've together been able to mark Holocaust Memorial Day in this way, and to have your support on this. And I'd like to close by reiterating my thanks, both to you, Rob, and to you, Kirsty, for making this event such a stimulating intellectually, but also commemoratively astute and humbling one. So thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for joining. And good night.
Good night. Thank you.